Welcome to the Retronaut, a new computing channel. Now, you might be thinking that in this video we might be digging into the insides of a Commodore 64, or we might be lovingly stroking the dead rubber keys of a ZX Spectrum, or we might be talking about the virtues of an Atari 400 or Apple II game. Well, we're not, because in this video I'd like to introduce both myself and my channel to you, and as it were, set up my stall and explain what this channel aims to do. And also what it probably is not going to try and do, though of course you should never say never. This channel is called the Retronaut as it's going to be about, in part, my own personal journey through computing, consoles and other related tech, from about the mid-70s onwards. Why the mid-70s? Well, there are two reasons. Number one, because I was 5 in the middle of 1975, and as a result, the mid-70s really was where I became aware of computers at all. And before that point, computing wasn't really possible at home, and there were a number of reasons for this. So it was only by the mid-1970s that the cost of microprocessors and also RAM chips dropped to the point where it became feasible to make and sell computers that individuals could personally own. It then took the release of what the Americans called the Big Three, which was the TRS-80, the Commodore PET, and the Apple II in 1977 to create machines that made sense for typical families to buy. Then, over the next 30 years, there was a slow adoption of computing, mainly for gaming, but some productivity as well at home, home accounts and things like that. Whilst the workplace also undertook a slow transition away from centralized mini-computers, where people use terminals to access them, to having personal microcomputers. All the while, these microcomputers were unleashing more and more power into each scenario. And today, of course, that transition is pretty much complete. Pretty much everyone in the development world has a mobile phone in their pocket, and that mobile phone actually has more computing power than supercomputers from 20 years ago, which is in itself amazing. Anyone over 30 has had this experience to one degree or another. And as an observer, as a user, or one of those people that were actually trying to make the revolution happen, we were all probably involved in one way or another. Now, the name of this channel, the Retronaut, that can of course be equally applied to you, the viewer. I've got no idea, of course, what your own personal journey in tech is, when it started. And let's face it, pretty much everyone has a unique path through that ever-evolving landscape. This channel has, of course, to be from my perspective, simply because it's the only one I have easily to hand. But of course, my journey is no more important than your journey or anyone else's journey. But it did happen, and this channel, I hope, will act as a repository for the experiences that I had going through tech, how I got it, and also indeed, my modern encounters with technology that was simply before my time, or that was out of my budget at the time. Now, why have I started this channel right now? Well, just before COVID swept through the world, I just got into watching retro videos on YouTube, like a lot of people. And as the pandemic spread, we were all confined to our homes at some point, I think. So like so many others, I had spare cash as I couldn't go out. I couldn't really buy that much. There wasn't really any need to do certain things. I couldn't take holidays. And so I also, had a lot of time to kill. So I decided to get and then try and reconnect with the consoles and computers, which were either machines I had back in the day or which I did not encounter at all at the time. So for instance, I decided to get an Apple II, and this was a machine I didn't actually have back in the day. And the reason for that was where I grew up in South Wales, they were just way too expensive. And it just meant that basically nobody had one, nobody that I actually knew or anybody that even knew anybody else. But that doesn't mean the Apple II wasn't a very important machine. Of course it was, and it had a massive influence upon microcomputing back in the 1970s, especially in the United States. And of course then that had a knock-on effect in the UK and the rest of the world. Another reason I wanted an Apple II was because there was one particular Christmas, I think it was in 1984, where I received 10 floppy disk drive games from my Commodore 64. I actually bought a 1541 disk drive, and as part of that deal, it actually came with 10 other games. And I noticed that some of these were also listed in a magazine as being available for the Apple II. And I could see that these predated the Commodore 64. One of the main reasons for that was I noticed that they had a very distinctive style of graphics, and I could see that that was something that came from another computer. And I could see that that computer was the Apple II. So this piqued my interest. What was the Apple II, and what other games were available for it? Now, in terms of technology, I won't be limiting myself to any one manufacturer or platform. I was lucky enough back in the 80s to have friends who had VIC-20s, Spectrums, and Atari 800s, BBC Micros, and so on. Each of those machines had their strengths and weaknesses. And of course, if I had the money and the space at the time, I would have probably owned all of them. But at the same time, we all had to make choices. That's probably a good thing, to be honest. So again, I'm really interested in trying out and learning about those other systems. My basic rule is, if I'm interested in it, then it can be on the channel. And if you have any ideas in that regard, then I will of course be open to requests. One thing I'm not that heavy on is consoles. That might seem weird because my first two machines were actually consoles. But from then onwards, all of my machines, at least until the early 2000s, were computers. The main reason for this was I wanted to do things with my machine and not just consume, not just play games. I thought, well, it'd be quite cool if I could make games. So once I had my first computer, I didn't really look back, and I didn't really find consoles that interesting from then on. And another reason, though, was that there was a very large lull in the console market in the UK. From about 1983, where the Atari console crashed, until about 1986, which was when the NES was first released in the UK. And that kind of re-kick-started the console gaming market. But by then, I was in my teens, and the NES was really aimed at more children, so I wasn't really a NES person. It didn't really make that much of an impact here. And yeah, I was, playing on my Commodore 64, and I was really enjoying that. So yeah, the second coming of consoles really passed me by. I'm probably not going to focus heavily on electronic repairs, simply because I'm not an electronics expert. However, I have picked up some concepts, some tips and some tricks from other YouTube channels, such as the 8-Bit Guy, Adrian's Digital Basement, and of course, Dr. Chris Edwards and his excellent Amiga repairs. So I have carried out some relatively complex electronics repairs. But to be fair, it's not really my strength, and it's well covered in those other channels. So I will do some electronics repairs where my skills are up to it. But I'm more likely to show you the results and how I got there, rather than lengthy over-the-shoulder videos of me soldering things and using oscilloscopes and things like that. I may do it, but I'm probably going to do it off camera and then show you what actually happened. I'm also not heavily into taking old tech and upgrading it beyond all recognition. I'm more interested in trying to keep machines original where I can. Personally, I don't really see the point in taking a machine and putting a new CPU and RAM combo in it that just wasn't really possible at the time. I think this kind of distorts our view of old tech and can make it seem more capable than it was at the time. But each to their own. However, these days, original retro tech, it can cost an arm and a leg. So I have to be pragmatic about this. I'm not going to be religiously dogmatic about this particular aspect. Disk drives rely on floppy disks, and magnetic media ages and it becomes increasingly unreliable. So I can see why a Gotek floppy disk drive replacement would make a lot of sense. We also have HDMI displays these days. So sometimes you have to adapt an old machine to get it to work with new displays. So we'll take this all as we find it. So let's do a quick run through of my own tech journey. And my hope is this will help you to understand why I have certain views and experiences with certain machines and not with others. It's not because I necessarily did not like those other machines, absolutely not. It's just a case of only having so much time and money and having to move with technology as it progressed, which of course forced decisions on me as certain tech pivot points arrived. Did I get a ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, or an Electron? Some of the decisions came down to basically mental flips of a coin, really. I think this next section will inform your viewing when watching future Retronaut videos. But of course, feel free to skip this if you're not really interested in my tech journey.